We have the pleasure of introducing Brenda Barrett, who is the editor of the Living Landscape Observer, which is a website and a monthly newsletter that talks about land conservation, historic preservation, and sustainable communities. She is the former Director of Recreation and Conservation of the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and held positions as the National Coordinator for Heritage Areas at the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., and as the Director of Historic Preservation at the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. So she's a really awesome person to hear from, and I'm really looking forward to what she has to talk to us today about conserving culture and nature on a landscape scale. So please welcome our keynote speaker for today, Brenda Barrett. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone, and I'm very pleased to be with you today to talk about my favorite topic, which is how to work in creative partnerships so we can jump over political and disciplinary boundaries and do what seems almost impossible, which is to conserve and interpret cultural and natural values on a large lived-in landscape using the power of people in place. And I think we've already seen some of those wonderful presentations today that have shown how that happens. So we're just going to take a little romp today through the National Heritage Area idea, where did it come from, and dig a little bit also into some of the nature-based landscape scale conservation movements that are happening in the U.S. and around the globe. And as always, we'll be looking for some common ground. So again, I want to congratulate everybody here in the Calumet Heritage Partnership for your work and persistence over decades in building a foundation. And you've got all the puzzle pieces here to be a heritage area. You've got the globally rare and natural plant and communities. You've got a historic story of industrial might. You've got lots of parks and protected lands. You've got a rich mix of people and cultural diversity. And you've got the challenge of working in 2 states and 71 municipalities, 1.5 million people. It just calls out. It begs for a heritage area approach. And it sounds like that's the direction you're going to go. And I agree with the National Park Service that this area, again, meets the criteria as a place where nature, natural and cultural and historic resources combine to form a cohesive, nationally important landscape, which is, again, the definition of a national heritage area. And is it realistic to hope for national recognition? I would say, despite congressional concerns about the role of government, and we've seen that play out with the national monument designations recently, heritage areas are still open for business. There's still a lot of bipartisan support for heritage areas, and the 49 national heritage areas that are already designated are, many of them are thriving and still out there. So let's take a quick look at where this idea came from, because a lot of it resonates with the landscape that I have seen in the last day or so. For some of the specific ideas, the states led the way. Massachusetts had a heritage park program in 1976. They designated an area in the city of Lowell, again, a struggling industrial site. New York followed along with its urban cultural park program and created the Hudson Mohawk region in 1977. Again, industry was a factor there. And of course, these were not traditional parks, but they were urban landscapes that focused on the industrial heritage of the region and really tried to boost community vitality that in an area where there had been a decline of manufacturing. And again, this certainly should sound familiar to folks here. Now, my own home state of Pennsylvania, in the late 1970s, we began to talk about using ideas from our neighbors to the north of us to deal with some of the economic shifts that were going on in Pennsylvania, particularly the collapse of the steel industry, which caused reverberations across the state. And there was a lot of interest in finding a replacement economy, and heritage tourism, the heritage tourism sector was looked at as a possibility. So again, borrowing freely from other places, the Pennsylvania Heritage Park Program was developed as a comprehensive effort to coordinate natural and cultural conservation, recreation, community awareness, and education. Again, does this sound familiar? And the program was very closely tied to the economic development process of Pennsylvania. And the thought was that these heritage parks, especially if they were centered in deindustrializing areas, might give those areas a better quality of life and an economic boost. And eventually, the idea took hold, spread across the state, and today there are 12 heritage parks in Pennsylvania, and all of them are thriving to this day. Now, at that time, talk is a little bit of a personal journey for me because I was at the State Historic Preservation Office, and we latched on to that idea of industrial heritage, one of my favorite topics, and we thought, what can we do to help support this program? So we did a publication called Made in PA in 1991, looking at what were the most important industrial factors in Pennsylvania, and that publication was used as part of the criteria for designating those 12 heritage parks in Pennsylvania. And we also worked with the National Park Service to list some of the key steel sites as National Historic Landmarks. That's the Carey Furnace and the Cambria Iron Works in Johnstown, and we targeted our money, most importantly, to heritage park projects. But we, of course, the state of Pennsylvania was not the only player in all of this, and I want to give a lot of credit to the National Park Service's Rivers and Trails and Conservation Assistance Program, and Paul, one of the leaders of that program in the past, and that was a small program in the National Park Service, which was to help communities preserve their natural resources and outdoor recreational projects. And it was built, it was just hardwired in partnership. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, that program, the Resource Trail and Conservation Association, was doing some very innovative work in Pennsylvania, reimagining how to use, for example, our rail and canal corridors as an economic and recreational asset. So those ideas stimulated the heritage area ideas in Pennsylvania. Now, in the year 2000, back to my personal journey, I changed teams. I left Pennsylvania and I went to work for the National Park Service as the National Coordinator for Heritage Areas. So I had some real close and personal experience with the National Park Service in what was then the fastest growing landscape scale program of all, the National Heritage Areas. Now, the National Heritage Area idea has been around for over 3 decades, and its earliest roots are right here in our backyard. I mean, we practically can see the Illinois and Michigan Canal National Heritage Area from where we stand. And that designation was created in 1984. President Reagan, I think, came to this area and signed the legislation for this new idea and this new park designation. And it was carefully crafted to meet the then administration's goals of A, limited federal land ownership, limited financial exposure for the federal government. But it also met the community's goals, which were a solution to obtain National Park Service recognition and technical assistance, but at the same time allow communities to control their own destiny and to set their own priorities. And National Heritage Areas have been very, very popular. Today, there are 49 designated areas, and the program is still, witness all the people in this room, is still extremely popular. Now, I'll be frank, as an agency, the National Park Service has struggled with how to incorporate these large landscapes into their own legislative structure. And also the challenge of working with landscapes that are governed not directly by the Park Service, but by local communities. And again, this is very challenging to the Park Service's philosophy, to the Park Service's culture, and as fiscal constraints grew within the agency, it became even more difficult. So over the years, there have been challenges, both congressional and within the Park Service, to how effective are heritage areas. If at the same time when Congress is pushing more heritage areas on the public, are they effective in protecting resources? How can, without clear authority, regulations, and land ownership, how can these areas really preserve resources? How can they show that they're really delivering good outcomes? So to answer those questions, national heritage areas have been subjected to some very rigorous evaluation processes, more so than I would say almost any other program. And as your group starts down the road for national heritage areas, National Heritage Area designation, you might want to hear what some of the findings of those evaluations are. So what were some of the critical ingredients that these evaluations found? One was telling compelling stories. And again, we've heard already today some of these compelling stories here. And a critical ingredient of all heritage areas seems to be that strong sense of place and compelling stories. And this is true with state heritage areas as well. Certainly that was true in Pennsylvania, where the stories were really important. People could see themselves in the story, they could see their grandparents in the story, and most importantly, they could see their children in the story of the future. And again, I've read your feasibility study, and you have those powerful stories. And some of these powerful stories come from really underserved communities and unrecognized communities. And our last panel really spoke to the importance of including everyone in telling these stories. So what was the outcome? The evaluation studies showed that the outcome was that heritage areas harness those stories and have very exceptionally good interpretive and educational programs. So that's sort of one really important outcome. Another factor are the convening partners and the convener of heritage areas. Heritage areas, national heritage areas at least, are placed in the portfolio of the National Park Service. And the Park Service has been an important convener. They've been an honest broker. They've added some funding that always sweetens the pot and catches everybody's attention. But conveners don't have to be the National Park Service. In Pennsylvania, the convener for the Pennsylvania Heritage Parks program was the state of Pennsylvania, was a state agency. And again, they met the criteria of calling the meetings and acting as an honest broker and not having a parochial interest and not competing with the partners at the table. So anyone who can invite that larger community to the table could serve as a convening partner. And again, here you have some strong convening partners. It's extremely important, and that is another critical ingredient to a good heritage area. Community engagement, I think it's just obviously really, really important, and all of you know how important it is. I was a classic historic preservation person when I jumped into this. I didn't understand that it's those community stories and the people that's so important. But as I went to meeting after meeting in setting up the Pennsylvania Heritage Parks program, I realized it was the people who are defining the story, and that the connections that they make, not just to one historic site, but to the larger fabric of the community and to the ecosystem, that is really critical. I felt myself rising up to a 1,000-foot level, and it was very exciting. And I've never wanted to come down from that high ever since. And finally, Heritage Park management plans. The evaluations called out these management plans as critically important. And the fact that the heritage areas in Pennsylvania and at the national level use this two-step planning process of, first of all, identifying what are the criteria, does this area meet the known criteria that seem to work, and then what's the management plan based after the criteria is met, what are we going to do about it? And the evaluations took a deep dive into the management plans of some of the 49 heritage areas and said, these management plans are amazing. Over a 5, 10, 15, 20, 25-year period, they're actually achieving the things that they identified in the management plan. So again, very important process, the management plans, because they eventually deliver. If we have all the pieces in place, those management plans will deliver the outcomes that people said that they wanted. So I want to just, again, in my personal journey, say that in 2007, I changed teams again, and I went to work for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. That took me really to the green side, and I helped manage a new program in Pennsylvania to using the ideas from National Heritage Areas and the Pennsylvania Heritage Areas to focus on conservation landscapes. And this was another landscape scale program that was focused on revitalizing communities through engaging local and regional partners, but it was primarily focused on nature conservation and economic development. So I just now want to dig in on one of the projects, because I've talked sort of more generally and up here, and I thought you might want to see what's actually happened on the ground when you apply this large landscape philosophy to an area. So if you look at the top of the Pennsylvania map there, you see a big green blob, which we call the Pennsylvania Wilds. It was the most ambitious of all the large landscape initiatives, and it was centered on a very rural 12-county region, which was known for its public lands and small historic communities. 2 million acres of protected lands, 29 state parks, 8 state forests, Allegheny National Forest, and it's one of the largest pieces of public land on the East Coast, and it's about the equivalent size of Yellowstone. Now, that area had a horrible history of devastation, cycles of boom and bust, timbering, coal mining, oil and gas drilling. But by the 21st century, the mountains had reforested, the streams were recovering, being remediated from acid mine drainage, and it was attracting a lot of visitors to fish, hunt, and for other kinds of recreation. So they brought in sort of a new image for the area. Our agency launched the idea of building on a wilderness experience, and they hoped that tourists would come and enjoy nature and the great outdoors, and that this would build a strong recreational economy. And the state of Pennsylvania, they believed in it so much they invested $126 million into that region. But we also, this is something I really learned through the public involvement process, the people who lived there said, wilds, we're not wild, we have local communities. Elk is just a little bit of the area. So we had to do a little course correction, and we had to refocus on the community. And I think, again, this really brings me to those lessons of how important listening to people are. Because based on the pushback that we got, we took a slightly different direction. We partnered with our economic development program for a small business ombudsman to connect business startups with funding and technical assistance, really focusing again on the small communities. An artisan trail was developed to promote regional artisans and art-related businesses. And sales outlets were developed in the historic communities and in our state parks. And we looked to build an economy on ecotourism, but also on locally developed products and that recognize the cultural values of the community, and most importantly, retain the money in the community, making that money stick to the hands of the people that live there. So that was, again, just to dive down in, that role of, the triple bottom or double bottom line of doing good and doing well. So today, just again to share a little more of what I'm working on, I'm an independent scholar, i.e. I'm retired, I'm outside of government, and no one pays for me generally, and I spend a lot of my time trying to understand, because I'm passionate about it, how do these large landscapes work? How widespread is the movement? What's the dimensions and contours of the field? And just want to report to you that there's a lot of stuff going on all around the world. In England and Wales, we have the 46 areas of outstanding national beauty, which are, again, lived-in landscapes with heritage value. In France, we have the 43 regional parks, again, rural areas defined by locally produced goods and a local sense of place. a year or so ago, I was so fortunate to be one of the World Heritage Reviewers for the English Lake District National Park. Again, a landscape shaped over a 1,000-year period. That's still a working landscape that's lived in, but is a large national park and visited by 17 million people. And coming back to the United States, there's a burgeoning large landscape movement. A recent survey identified over 300 such initiatives in North America, and that doesn't even count the heritage area movement, and that are really based more on preserving, or at least began to be based on preserving nature conservation, looking particularly for connectivity of landscapes for, again, nature values, and addressing, though, some of the same challenges that we all face, those thorny challenges of urban expansion, of habitat fragmentation, invasive species, and of course, the biggest challenge of all, climate change. So, the federal government, too, has actually got into the mix here with the landscape conservation collaboratives. And this, in the last administration, this program was really going gangbusters. The Department of Interior divided the country into 22 large landscapes based on ecosystem indicators. And the program was, again, very much across political boundaries and trying to merge disciplinary knowledge to work collaboratively on problems, particularly climate change. And while the program in the current administration has fallen out of favor, to put it mildly, it is actually reforming outside of the walls of federal government right now in a new way. And that's happening because these ideas are so important. And this large landscape approach now even has its own advocacy and knowledge sharing organization, so I recommend to many of you the Network for Landscape Conservation. It was kicked off at a meeting in 2014 in DC, but since then it's gathered steam, it's picking up power, and it's really broadening out its scope to look not just at nature conservation, but taking a much larger and more expansive view. This Network for Large Landscape Conservation just issued this is right hot off the press, a new report, Progress and Priorities in Landscape Conservation. And it includes a lot of discussion about the issues of cultural heritage, involving communities that have been traditionally not at the table, and focusing on some of those hard-won lessons that the national heritage areas have developed, and using those as guidance for large landscapes overall. And I think it's critical to see that the benefits really flow two ways. And I really see myself more as a cultural person, the cultural community really can learn a lot and gain a lot of guidance and funding and partnerships from the conservation and land conservation community, but they need our human and people touch just as much to really be successful and to build long-standing sustainability. And then finally, back to the international stage, there's some really big ideas out there. At the World Conservation Congress in 2016, where I actually met Mark Bowman, the international bodies for nature conservation, IUCN, and the international bodies for cultural conservation, ICOMOS, launched a dedicated program called the Nature Culture Journey, which is trying to bring practitioners together. You guys already have done it, but more nationally, internationally, it hasn't been done. And there have been now conferences and events discussing this all over the world, recently in Delhi, Fiji, and I'm working on a conference right now in San Francisco that will take place next month, Forward Together, focusing on more effective conservation. So you can see I've just given you sort of a broad outlines of how big this is and what an important part of the piece of the puzzle that you play. You're not alone. There's lots of people out doing the good work that you're doing, and you are also leading the way for them. And I'd like to leave everyone with a quote from one of my favorite scholars who just passed away a couple of weeks ago, David Lowenthal. And at a conference in 1992 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, Paul, I don't know if you were there for that, but he said, living traditions need constant rekindling. Nothing stays the same. Memory and hope evolve along with nature and culture. Heritage parks ossify unless change is built into them. And by having people at the table and by putting people at the center, you won't ossify. You'll always be ready for change. So thank you so much. Question was, what's going to happen to all this in the current administration? And my answer is that the current administration is just one voice. Congress is another voice. And right now, and you around this table and across the country are another voice. So right now, heritage areas, for example, the National Heritage Area Program, the administration proposed cutting the funding for that program. And guess what? Congress put the money back. So, and then passed the budget with the money in it. So the your congressional delegation, my congressional delegation in Pennsylvania are very supportive of heritage areas. And so that's where we are. And I agree, some programs have been suffering, but right now the Heritage Area Program has managed to escape because of its strong popular support.
Can you elaborate on the reforming outside of the federal government, sort of the ecosystem management?
Yes, and again, I don't think there's no final decision on this, but the landscape conservation collaboratives, they did not survive. In the current administration, they were sort of the big red pencil went through their budget, but Congress again put some of the money back, but the money was put back. In a way to ask the state fish and wildlife officials how that money should be spent. So right now there's lots of discussions going on about what would a new landscape conservation collaborative model look like that was more focused on the role of states and the role of wildlife management. I know in places like Alaska, I talked to some of the folks up there, they feel that the landscape collaborative was so important that they're just keeping it going with no federal money. They're just putting up state money, local money, tribal money, and they're just doing it outside the walls of government. And I think that's really the message in part for everybody in this room and for people that care about landscape conservation, which is, hey, the federal government is great, state governments are great, but we really need to pull up our own bootstraps and act. If we want to do landscape conservation, we just need to do it. We have the power as people to do it. Does that answer your question?
Question. I think the quote comes from an Irish movie called The Field, where a farmer in the west of Ireland is bemoaning that none of the tourism money comes to him, and he says, "I can't eat the landscape."
Right.
What have you seen in your career, in your experience working with community engagement, that actually generated revenue from cultural heritage resources?
Again, that's an excellent question, and I think the example I gave in the Pennsylvania wilds has been the most studied. I think there's some other studies of the economic value of heritage areas, and we certainly heard Paul's excellent disquisition on how national parks deliver economic value, not just quality of life value, but real dollars to the local community. But in the Pennsylvania wilds, by focusing on revitalizing the small communities and revitalizing it not by bringing in chain motels or chain restaurants, but bringing in locally based businesses, those dollars that come in, which might be a lot less than big tourism dollars, but those dollars that stick in the community, stick in people's local pockets, are the most valuable dollars there are. So I think there is an economic study on the Pennsylvania wilds that shows that there has been economic benefit from the designation. And even though people go, well, those are just service jobs. Well, small businesses are not just service jobs. I mean, I was up there and I visited, they had a local distillery that had opened up. They had a print shop where, you know, 2 Carnegie Mellon grads decided to go back home to their region and set up a printing business, and they have a worldwide base of customers now because the internet allows them to do that. So I think those, making those small improvements and thinking about how do you keep the money in the community is really important.
Brenda, can you talk to the role of trails and how those trail connections have become a piece of the regional heritage?
I certainly can, and again, there were so many things I could have delved into in this talk, but one of the things that in Pennsylvania in particular, we made a huge priority in both the state and national heritage areas in completing long-distance trails, because the research that had been done by the Rails to Trails Conservancy and by other organizations show that if you connect trails together and give people the idea that they can go 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles, even if they're not going to do that, they tend to use those trails more. They see them as, symbols of the area. And we have made, in Pennsylvania, we really made it a big priority for our heritage areas to finish the trail connections. And the Delaware and Lehigh Trail we're 10 miles from having a 180-mile trail from the Scranton down to Philadelphia. It's going to be amazing. And the work on the Great Allegheny Passage that goes from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C., the economic impact of that has been amazing. I mean, it's been written up in the New York Times and Washington Post, and people, I'm running into people all the time who said, yeah, we're coming to Pennsylvania, we're going to ride the Great Allegheny Passage. And little bed and breakfasts and restaurants and bike shops and, outfitters have just sprung up in what were really, really desolate bituminous coal towns and patch towns in western Pennsylvania. So I think the role of trails is very, very important, and I'm glad to see some happening on the ground out here. So make them big, make them long. Yes?
I'd like to ask the economic development question maybe from the reverse, and I'm really struck by the emphasis that you put on the economic development.
Well, that was just a choice. I could have picked other topics, but.
Well, and that gets a little bit to my question.
Right.
Which is, how important is economic development to gaining local acceptance of a heritage area, gaining the commitment that it takes to be sustainable?
Well, I think it's the kind of thing that opens the door and gets people's attention, but in the end, it's their heart. And in the end, it's, this is honoring my grandparents. This is honoring my father. We heard that today. This is for the future of my children. And you can't always put a price on that. So I think economic development catches people's attention. And in some cases, it's critical. There won't be, some of these small communities in the Pennsylvania wilds, some of the counties up there, they were having trouble fielding a kindergarten class. They didn't have 35 children being born in the county. So, they really needed, some economic future. But in the end, it's passion. And passion for the dollar is important, but passion for your community and the people you love is more important.
In your beginning slides, the heritage areas included industry and maybe even were originally mapped around industry? Or did I misunderstand that?
Excuse me, in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania, for the Pennsylvania Heritage Park Program, which is a state program, the focus was on industrial heritage and defined broadly. So the steel industry, manufacturing, railroads, transportation, canals. So that was the focus for the Pennsylvania program. For the national heritage areas, each heritage area defines what's important for them. So here, industry may be part of the story, but it's also could be the diverse, cultural communities. It could be the mosaic of, rare and endangered species and the diversity of the environment. So it's culture and nature.
I drove over this morning from Valparaiso, and so I was just struck again by how much the steel industry is like right here, and then suddenly you make a right turn and you're in this golf course.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of crazy. So, but where's, and this might not be a question, maybe a question for people in the room, where is the steel industry in this conversation? Because aren't they going to be necessary, one of these partners, to actually facilitate the heritage region? And does anybody know if they?
Does someone want to? That's not my area of expertise. So.
So I could say perhaps a word or two that might get in the direction of answering your question. And in this kind of crazy National Heritage Area, which is actually probably a good name for it, because it is a place where all this stuff just sort of comes together and it's hard to interpret, but it's all here. The steel industry has been actually, there are now two major players.
item on that history listserv. Isn't it time to try to see what the people may want? And that basically, instead of saying, this is a great thing, this is a great idea, rather than wait for the pushback, isn't it time to get buy-in and get grassroots going?
I'm going to turn this conversation over to the local people. I mean, I think we see that there's different folks at the table right now, and another boss of mine in the past has always said to me, the people that come to the table are the right people to be at the table. But I think one point you're making that is important is that the people that care and the folks that are at the table right now, when ideas become more concrete, they sometimes come out of the woodwork, or they suddenly wake up and go, wait a minute, no one ever told me. So I mean, I think that that's a very good point, and that's why, particularly as you develop any management planning, there really needs to be a lot of community engagement, a lot of really strong community engagement in what, where do we want to go with this? I think there's going to be I think that you have a consensus, a general consensus about the importance and what the values are, but where do you go? What do you do first is extremely important and is a sensitive question.
You touch on a subject that's been a sore point for me for 20 or more years. I covered theater for about 15 years in Northwest Indiana and South suburban Chicago area, and groups always wanted coverage on their opening night. And I was the sole cover at the time. And so sometimes they'd be asking me to cover 5 theaters across a 3-state range, from Michigan to Illinois, and all those stops in between. And we worked with groups and keep saying, why don't you guys share schedules? Because my second night review was no good because you're finished. You only do 2 nights anyway, 2 weeks. So if I don't get you first night, you don't want me anyway, because what good is it? It's history now. And we found the same thing with the kind of meetings we have here. I looked at the schedule. You can look at our website right now. The number of groups that are meeting today that are doing important things, we practically have to say, can we slice and dice ourselves to go to these meetings?
Right.
If somebody would share schedules, you'd still have conflicts, but maybe you could cut the conflicts by 80% by doing some intelligent scheduling. We never do that. And so it's, which child do you want to sacrifice this week? All of these meetings are important. Everything, but we can't go to all of them at the same time. We're here today, but we also want to be some other places today, and we can't. And it's kind of a crapshoot anyway, but this happened to be first. And this has been important to us for a long time. The Calumet region is tremendously important, but there are other important things happening today too. We can't do one. If we could schedule better and share schedules better, we might get more turnout and more commitment and more involvement from a larger proportion of the community. Just a thought.
Okay, put it on the list, guys. Seriously, although I was missing Grandparents' Day yesterday because October is always a busy time, so.
We've got some more time. Other questions? Discussion? Yeah, go ahead.
Where does the youth play in all this, such as middle schoolers, high schoolers, and even early college students, as they probably are good assets for
Right.
furthering the mission?
Well, again, I didn't get to dig deep into the issue of education and interpretation, but I would say unequivocally that the National Heritage Areas have the best place-based education programs out there. And I particularly will point to 2. One is the Salem Maritime, the folks, the Essex National Heritage Area in Massachusetts, who partner with Salem Maritime National Historic Site. They have an incredible high school, middle school, high school place-based program for students, and including for some lucky students sailing on the Friendship, which is a recreated sailing ship. So they have an amazing program, and I know I know about it in part because I had a thesis student who did a project analyzing that place-based education, and then also saw how the National Park Service programs, sort of ranger, teacher, ranger, really worked into these place-based programs. And another important place-based program is the Journey Through Hallowed Ground in Virginia, which runs from Gettysburg down through Virginia. And they have done just amazing adventure camps for middle school students. They've done lots of video programs for students who develop their own podcasts. They've partnered with Harper's Ferry, the Harper's Ferry Center, to do interpretation. They did a large program on John Brown and brought in, children from, high school kids from the whole region. So I think there's a lot of strong place-based programming, and again, I think the National Park Service should really take advantage. Again, this is really a wonderful place for partnership, because the heritage areas have little more of the capacity to do more place-based education and expand the reach of a specific national park. And I've certainly seen that happen all across the country. So yes, very, very important. It's really important, but we all need to do more, particularly to bring people up through programming into professional or technical positions. I mean, it's one thing to go out to a middle school and engage them in a program. It's one thing to even go to a high school. But where we really need, and I think everybody needs to work on this, is how do you take those high schoolers through either a technical program or college so they end up with a career and a job. So that's in heritage, and I think that's important.
Is the fact that this area crosses 2 states an asset? And if it is an asset, in getting it actually done, is there a way we can leverage that asset?
Well, that's a really good question. First of all, nothing but a heritage area or landscape scale effort could cross 2 state boundaries. So there is no other approach that will do this. So that's number one. If not us, who could possibly do this? I also was telling folks yesterday, heritage areas and large landscapes work. They work well when they're under somewhat of a threat. And actually, having political complexity is a threat. That brings people together. People go, wait a minute, right over there in Indiana they're doing this, and in Illinois they're doing that, and that's a threat to stability and a threat to the system. So how do we actually work around it? And the heritage area strategy is one way to do that. So I think the answer is I don't know. It might be an incentive to doing it, and it may be the only way, the only mechanism. One of the reasons I think Pennsylvania has so many state and national heritage areas is that, like Illinois, we have a gazillion units of local government. We have 2,582 local governments in Pennsylvania, each one with their own land use planning, their own everything. And we had to have heritage areas, and we had to have these strategies, because otherwise we couldn't function. I mean, it forced us to work together. So.
One more. In your career travels, it sounds like you've dealt a lot with all these different small organizations and local places. And one of the common experiences is that they have their agendas, and they oftentimes resort to positional negotiation versus, say, issues-based. Can you offer any suggestions for how to get folks from competing monologues to a dialogue?
Well, again, this is where it takes a lot of time and a lot of talking and a lot of meeting, but there's 2 things, I think, that help. One is having a convener who, again, is the honest broker, the National Park Service, the Pennsylvania DNR, somebody who's, the Field Museum possibly, somebody who's not directly in competition, who can come in and knock heads together. No, not really, but you can come in the nicest possible way and look for common ground. And then the other thing is looking for those common grounds, identifying, where is that overlap? Because, again, as someone who has been a grants administrator, for example, had to feed the thousands of nonprofits, I see the struggle, looking for money, seeing your neighbor at the next table as competition, when actually, we're trying to raise all ships by this work. So I think, again, having a convener function really can help. So this is where the heritage area landscape scale approach can be the solution to the threat. So again, I hope to talk to more of you throughout the day, and it's been a pleasure being here, and I just want to thank everybody for doing some great work out there. I've just so enjoyed this region. Thank you.